Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Professor Paul Cantor. He's an important professor at the University of Virginia, where he's the Clifton Waller Barrett Professor of English. He's written a lot of books on Shakespeare, Shakespeare's Rome and Hamlet, and on romanticism. His book Creature and Creator, which is based on his Harvard course on creatures and creators a few years ago. And he's written on the media, Gilligan, Unbound, which also includes The Simpsons. And he's written on Austrian economics, literature and the economics of liberty. This is something recent. He's a graduate of Harvard from class of 1966 and got his PhD here in English in 1971. He's now teaching Government 1087, which is Shakespeare and politics. So this is Paul Cantor.
Well,
his title is The Apocalyptic Strain in Popular Culture.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me do a quick survey to gauge how to pitch my talk. How many of you have read that essay that we sent out? Okay, then I will confess I'll repeat some of it for those of you who haven't. How many of you are fans of The Walking Dead? Oh,
Explain what that is.
I will. It's a TV show. Anybody seen Revolution or any horror? How about Falling Skies? Anyone fans of that? Okay, there's going to be a lot of plot exposition here and maybe spoilers too. Any zombies in the crowd? Okay, okay. I don't have to use the term existentially challenged for them. I was kind of hoping they'd show up, but they walk very slowly, so maybe they're still on their way. Okay, let's get going here. I am here at Harvard to teach Shakespeare, but it's nice to be able to continue my work on popular culture. It strikes some people as odd, but first of all, I think television shows, movies, they often do reflect the fears and anxieties and hopes and desires of the American people, and it's interesting to study them for that reason. They also have a surprising political component, which I'm going to try to explore here. Increasingly, they're also of high quality. I truly believe that television is now the most sophisticated artistic medium in the world and attracting greater and greater talents. I truly believe that if Shakespeare were alive today, he would be writing for television. He did the equivalent in his own day, and the Elizabethan theater he wrote for had exactly the status that television does in our culture. So I was working on a book called The Invisible Hand in Popular Culture and wrote a section on alien invasions that concludes the book. And I began to sense a pattern, the interest in apocalypse in American popular culture, end of the world as we know it narratives. And I saw that there were now a lot of zombie shows around. I'd never liked zombies, I will confess. Nothing personal, but I liked Val Lewton's movie, I Walked with a Zombie, but I never liked the George Romero movies, Night of the Living Dead, and I'll maybe explain that in a little while. But there was this show, The Walking Dead, and it seemed to be getting a lot of attention, so I was 2 seasons behind, but bought the DVDs and caught up on it and was pretty impressed by it and began to see parallels with what I'd done with alien invasion narratives, particularly the show called Falling Skies. Anyway, I started to see a pattern. I was searching for some kind of wish fulfillment in these stories. These end-of-the-world narratives are pretty grim. Horrible things happen. There's so much destruction and so much threat to life. And I began to wonder, well, is there anything that makes these narratives attractive to people? Now, it's true they reflect anxieties about global warming and about nuclear war and all sort of earthquakes, asteroids hitting. There are all sorts of apocalyptic narratives in our broader culture that those same anxieties gets translated to these shows. But I started looking at a bunch of them, and again, things are pretty miserable after the apocalypse. Comet hits, aliens invade, a zombie plague breaks out. And I kept saying, well, what's the compensation for all of this? And searching through the narratives, it finally dawned on me. We've lost everything we thought we liked in life, but the one thing we can say is at least we've gotten rid of the federal government. And that does seem to be the common element. And I think these shows do reflect an anxiety about the bureaucratization of modern life, the institutionalization of modern life, that they all deal with an apocalypse that allows people to get back to basics and to live a simpler and more direct life. Let me use Falling Skies as an example. This is a TBS summer show, basically. The hero is a BU professor. I hope that doesn't offend anybody. But it's truly the only TV show that's ever had a BU professor as its hero. This is an alien invasion narrative. Aliens have come in, and the first thing they do is to take out the federal government. Part of their plan of taking over the U.S., and everyone is reduced to militia situations. In fact, it takes place largely in Massachusetts. The guy's a history professor, so there's all sorts of evocations of the Minutemen and the American Revolution and the spirit of '76. And the idea is, in the absence of the U.S. Army and a federal response to this danger, people have to band together into a Massachusetts National Guard unit or whatever and fight the aliens. And again, life is pretty miserable under these circumstances. But what happens is that power devolves to people. It does become much more localized. The show evokes the spirit of the New England town meeting. And behind all these shows is a kind of Tocqueville spirit. That government is better when it's closer to the people, and that people do have the power to organize themselves. And the thrust of all these shows that are positive is that in the face of disaster, people wouldn't simply passively accept it, but they would band together to deal with the issue and try to make the best of their lives, fight the aliens in this case, somehow reconstitute civilization. Now, some examples of this. BU classes are canceled. There's the whole educational system falls apart under these circumstances. At one point, they're hiding out in an abandoned middle school, for example. But what happens is what I can only describe as homeschooling. Suddenly, the parents are forced to teach their children themselves. And suddenly, the kids like school. It's preferable to the apocalypse. But really, one of the great themes of the show, it's a Steven Spielberg show, so it's all about bonding, and especially father-son bonding. But suddenly, the parents are educating their own children. The children are learning more. You wouldn't think that Hollywood would turn out something in praise of homeschooling, but that's what this is. Then medical care. Mass General shuts down. There's no more hospitals. And that's a problem, obviously. You're not going to get all that wonderful medical care that's available in Boston. And it really is said here, this show. But finally, you got a doctor who'll make a house visit, make a house call. I'm old enough to remember when doctors would come to your house and take care of you. And one of the heroines of the story is a pediatrician. And it actually sets up a juxtaposition between a hospital-based, high-level research physician who, by the way, is more interested in studying the aliens than in doing anything about them, and this woman who just cares for people and takes care of them. The hospital physician is killed by one of these aliens he's so curious about. But again, it seems to reflect anxieties about modern medicine and the distance between patients and doctors. By the way, this is one of the greatest themes in modern television all across the spectrum. One of the great, judging by television, one of the great horrors of the American psyche is the hospital system and its inhuman, uncaring treatment of patients. The most frightening scene in most television shows today is a scene in a hospital room. The great new show Better Call Saul had one of them just last week. And again, it seems to reflect this ongoing and pervasive anxiety among the American people that the systems that govern them are distant from them and out of touch with them. And these apocalyptic narratives put people back in touch. The doctor now lives among you. This is true in The Walking Dead as well. So right down the line, what you see is these shows are a tribute to the self-organizing power of the American people, something that Tocqueville was already celebrating in the 19th century. I should say that there's two kinds of narratives, and I'm discussing one of them. I'm discussing the Lockean kind of narrative, not the Hobbesian kind of narrative. That is, another way of understanding these shows is they are explorations of the state of nature, as it's understood in political theory. They really are thought experiments. Let's get rid of government, and especially a national government, and see how people make do, and can they survive. Some of these shows I would describe as Hobbesian. That what they show is people are helpless in the absence of a central government, in the absence of a big government, that what will result is simply the war of all against all. The zombie movie World War Z, I think, took that line. That movie never met a government that it didn't like. It even offered the United Nations Navy, the non-existent United Nations Navy, as the way to save the world from the zombie epidemic. So you do get a whole class of narratives that take the view that people can't organize themselves and that they're really helpless in the face of these kind of threats. A lot of the flying saucer movies, the 1950s, took that form. But the ones I like are the ones that show the resilience of the American people, their resourcefulness, the fact that when they're put on their own, they can do well. By the way, that's why I don't like the George Romero zombie movies, which are essentially claiming that all Americans are just zombies. And therefore they're contemptible and not capable of taking care of themselves. What strikes me about a number of these narratives, and The Walking Dead is perhaps the best example, is they show when people are left to themselves, they do get back to basics. One of the great themes of many of the shows I'm discussing is the family being reconstituted. A lot of these shows are about professionals who've become distant from their children because they work all the time. And, of course, this was one of the things that was celebrated in American television for a generation, especially the working mother. And in some ways, I think television has rediscovered the value of the family. Hollywood, in which the the family is traditionally understood barely exists, are now offering these images. Again, a father and son getting together. This guy was spending all his time on his classes at BU, and now he's having to watch his sons grow up and work with them, and he's with them 24/7. Now, in The Walking Dead, this was developed particularly in the first season. When the apocalypse happens, the first inclination of the people, it's set in Georgia, is to go to Atlanta because conveniently the Centers for Disease Control are located there, and they figure if anyone will save them, it will be the CDC. Now, the CDC is presented in Walking Dead as the absolute epitome of the government science combination gone crazy. In fact, there's only one guy left in the CDC, and he's borderline sane in this episode. There are little hints that maybe the government is responsible for the zombie outbreak. This scientist explains that the CDC had weaponized smallpox, for example, and the whole fear in this episode is the CDC is running out of electricity and all these viruses and other germs are going to be released. And anyway, it does not present a very rosy portrait of the CDC. By the way, perhaps in response to this, the CDC has created its own zombie comic book. You can just go to the CDC, search for zombie on the CDC website, and I think it's still there, Zombie Pandemic. If you're ever wondering about your tax money, you might inquire into this little episode. The CDC, in its own comic book, solves the zombie plague problem in about a week, coming up with a variant of the flu vaccine. That didn't inspire the greatest confidence in me, personally. But anyway, there are strange things going on out there, and I'm always amused to discover them. The intrepid warriors of the Walking Dead, they're not saved by the CDC. They think of going to Fort Benning in Georgia, but learn that the army was overrun by zombies. Again, you have a little hint of that homeschooling aspect in the show, that the parents are teaching the children. The medical care issue is very strong. Again, in the Walking Dead, the whole show opened the first season with the soon-to-be hero Rick Grimes waking up in a hospital and finding it was overrun by zombies. And in fact, this show is based on a comic book, and the comic book version suggests even more strongly that the government's response to the zombie outbreak was to try to concentrate people, bring them all to Atlanta, put them all in hospitals. The result was to spread the zombie plague much wider and much faster, which again is interesting in light of some actual government policies, the whole business with Hurricane Katrina of trying to centralize everybody in the Superdome in New Orleans. It did not lead to cannibalism as was initially reported, but it turned out to be a disastrous way of dealing with the problem. So the whole hospital system is presented in negative terms in The Walking Dead. The second season, they end up on a farm that's straight out of the 19th century with a Bible-quoting patriarch named Herschel. And he it is who saves the young boy Carl when he's accidentally shot. Only midway into the treatment do we learn that Herschel's a veterinarian. So not exactly the board-certified physician you might want treating your son, but he sits up all night with the kid and saves his life. And again, it's this very strong representation that medical care on the hospital level is impersonal and inhumane, and what we need is bringing people into contact and having the doctor right there for you. And there's this strong sense of this little band of people organizing themselves. Now to the issue of horses, which I used as my bait to lure some of you in. I don't advise going into the business of analyzing apocalyptic narratives, but it does have some rewards. I got to be on Al Jazeera America TV because of this article. In fact, I discovered if you Google apocalypse and popular culture, I come up first. So I've been interviewed in Brazil. It's very strange. But anyway, Al Jazeera TV contacted me to come on a show about the apocalypse in popular culture. I was the only in-studio guest, but the Angry Nerd participated on Skype. I do not know what his real name is, but his Skype moniker is the Angry Nerd. And he's well named. But he was making the point that these shows are crazy because they show people riding horses. And this really is true. I mean, the iconic shot of the first season of The Walking Dead was Rick Grimes, our hero, riding into Atlanta on a horse. And Michonne, one of our new heroines in the show, she rides a horse. Also carries a samurai sword, but I'll get to that in a minute. But in another show called Revolution, which if I have time I'll say something about, but there too the characters ride horses. And the Angry Nerd, I think quite rightly pointed out that a horse is not an efficient mode of transportation in an apocalypse. In fact, you'd eat it. Faced with all these, you don't want something you have to feed when the apocalypse comes. You want something to feed you. So, and a bicycle doesn't need to be fed. So why wouldn't you ride bicycles in the apocalypse instead of riding horses? And you know, this was a kind of literal-mindedness on the part of the Angry Nerd, but there were several doomsday preppers on this show. It was one of the weirder experiences in my life being on this show. But see, I had the answer, which is symbolic. This is where it pays to be an English professor and not a doomsday prepper. There are horses in these shows because they're really westerns. That these are simply recreations of the old American Western. They are attempts to take us back to the frontier. That they are, I mean, for example, The Walking Dead is basically wagon train with zombies. And in fact, when I sat down and analyzed it, you can see this in the essay, I mean, the zombies are the Indians. They have the same role that Indians had in the old politically incorrect Westerns. That is, they're nameless and faceless, and you can kill them with abandon. In fact, the aim with zombies is the genocide of zombies. And, you know, Westerns went out of fashion because of their political incorrectness and because you couldn't have Native Americans as the villains anymore, and you couldn't just kill them off indiscriminately, so now we got zombies in the same role. By the way, this is very strongly evident in World War Z, where zombies simply represent any third world population you can name. And again, it's fascinating to see that. But to get back to The Walking Dead, it essentially, especially in the second season, is a sort of wagon train narrative. They're on the road. They have an RV instead of a Conestoga wagon, but it's the same concept. And they're constantly dealing with zombies. They have to circle the RVs to fight off the zombies. They're trying to get to military posts, but when they get there, they find they've been overrun by zombies instead of being overrun by Indians. They have problems with strays, people who lose touch with the wagon train, or in this case, the RVs, and they endanger everybody by going searching. Again, I won't go into gory detail over this, but virtually every plot you find in the old Wagon Train movies or the old TV Wagon Train gets recreated in zombie terms in this. And it's very similar. Okay, I should say a few words about Revolution. It went off the air finally after 2 seasons. It was a terrible show, just badly written, badly acted, and so on. But it's very interesting politically. In this show, electricity disappears. We later learn it's probably the result of some federal government plot from the Department of Energy or something. And the whole world collapses, planes fall out of the sky, nothing functions, the federal government disappears again. And in fact, this is a show all about secession. The United States breaks up into smaller units. There's something called the Monroe Republic, there's the Georgia Republic, there's the Texas Republic, and the California Republic. I never thought to see a show that would kind of celebrate secession. And you'll be alternately horrified or relieved to learn in the very last episode, we learned that the Republic of Texas had conquered the Republic of California. And that is so symbolic. If you think about it, you wonder how much these guys writing the show were thinking about that. But that show is just filled with horses. Everybody's riding horses or using swords. And again, Michonne in The Walking Dead uses a sword. Westerns, samurai movies, it's all the same thing. If you can return to an earlier stage of technology, you can return to an earlier stage of political organization. And again, the thought seems to be government's better when it is closer to the people. Now, it occurred to me that these shows are then fulfilling the function that Westerns used to do in popular culture. So it's actually helped me to think through all this. I mean, the Western, when it flourished on television in the 1950s, it really was an alternative to that very neat life celebrated in American situation comedies of the 50s, where happiness was a nice suburban home with a mother and a father and 2.4 kids, and the father worked in an insurance company and the mother was a housewife and everybody was taken care of, and the biggest problem in life was Beaver got on the wrong bus and Wally had to go get him. And it was interesting that these shows, in effect, were paired with these much more primal and elemental Westerns, where a man didn't go in and work 9 to 5 in the morning and come home and, the most violent thing he did would be to send Beaver to bed without dinner or something. But you had these narratives about gunfighters and criminals and people who lived by the gun. By the way, I should say that, it's so strange, the disconnect between what Hollywood's ostensible politics and what they show. Gun control is not evident in any of these shows. These people have arsenals of weapons that would make a metropolitan police department envious, and they just love their weapons. And the finest moment is when a child or a woman gets to learn how to shoot someone with an automatic rifle. And it does reflect that, something that's deep in the American psyche, what we call the frontier spirit, the people learning to take care of themselves, and that means in the very basic sense of being able to defend themselves. I conclude from all this that American popular culture, so far as we can trace it back, has always been a kind of safety valve, that a great deal of popular culture exists to celebrate our society and its laws and our government. It's there to show us we're better off living under the rule of law and offer images of our being taken care of. whether it's medically, legally, educationally, or so on. But that has always rubbed up against the spirit of '76, the spirit of revolution on which this country was based, which is that the American people, above all, want to be free. And they want to be free to go their own ways, free to take care of themselves, and above all, to decide how to take care of themselves for themselves. And I think in the history of American popular culture, the Western often represented that principle, that celebration of American freedom and independence. And these, at least one group of these apocalyptic narratives, I think, is stepping in to fulfill that role again. Incidentally, the Western has been revived, most notably in the show Deadwood, which again is a show that celebrates freedom, independence, local self-government, and all these same points. Order in the mud, as its creator David Milch refers to it. But this is something I never thought of ahead of time. I actually work empirically. I just look at these shows, keep looking at them until something clicks, and I begin to see how these things work together. And so in that sense, I can see why these apocalyptic narratives are so attractive. I'll just add very quickly that there's a whole nother aspect of American television that fits into this same thing. And it is axemen, swamp people, ice road truckers. There's a whole genre on television that celebrates people who don't live in suburban tract homes and have 9-to-5 jobs. It celebrates people who are in dangerous occupations that are on the borders, the fringes of things. Again, I find this fascinating. I think we're in a great debate in America at the moment whether we want the administered society, the administered world, whether we want a bureaucratized world of security, or whether we want a world where people can be independent and take care of themselves. And I think this debate is being played out in American popular culture just as it has been for decades. So I'll leave it there, and I will be glad to answer, or at least attempt to answer any questions. Yes?
What about the people that watch? We had some, but what about how many people watch the shows, and then what kind of people do we know that?
I can give you the demographics. I mean, the Walking Dead, for example, is amazingly successful. It's the highest ratings of any cable show in history. It's now regularly in the top 10, which means it's competing with the network programs, the old networks, which means it's at a disadvantage. And it's huge in the male 18 to 49 demographic, the most coveted of all advertiser demographics. But, it's
the
very
stupidest.
also the most spirited, though. But they spend a lot of most disposable income. That's all. And so, I mean, again, it's very hard to say who watches what. I was apparently the only person to watch Revolution, and NBC figured that out and canceled it. But it took them 2 years to figure that out, though. But I don't like to pin it down to specific demographics. I think it's just, at a minimum, you can say that millions of people watch these shows. And that tells me it's appealing to something out there in the American psyche. And as I say, I try to figure it out. And as I say, once you see the link to Westerns, you see the deeper pattern here that Americans have always been attracted to stories of people who crave independence. I mean, our founding narrative, 76, is all about that. Yes?
So, when I was reading your article, I was thinking about a lot of zombie and alien movies in which the trend is that it's a universal threat against all of humanity, so it has the effect of uniting all of humanity.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's very interesting, as you point out, that these shows that you discussed this universal threat seems to be much more concerned with establishing, dealing with the sort of state of nature rather than the United Nations, so to speak. I wonder, if now that one little small point is in World War Z, the one country that seems to be doing very well is Israel, which closed itself off, and so there's a slight indication of sectarian advantage, and not the UN. But I wonder if somehow, even in the show like The Walking Dead, there isn't a strange strain of this kind of at least domestic cosmopolitanism, in as much as people from different backgrounds join the group, different races, different socioeconomic classes, and so it spreads the ideal of America, an egalitarian America, non-racist, and also that the group that the show centers on, their motto is sort of that goodness will triumph. They're continually presented with predatory enemy groups, and they somehow believe that not to violate certain kind of codes of conduct, and they'll accept others into their group as long as the others seem kind of decent and reliable and non-predatory, and they want to. And I just wonder if there isn't this strange way in which, in this very small-scale way, it tries to create another kind of very small incubator of cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, it is very striking in Walking Dead that the issue of race just doesn't come up. Despite the fact that there's there are African Americans, Asian Americans, and I think it is a kind of vision of unity. But I'm not saying there's anything un-American about these shows. In fact, I think they reflect one side of America. I mean, and it's the thing that Tocqueville pointed to, and that you see in the Western. Let's all get together and rebuild the barn. That's the great moment in the Western. And when we rebuild the barn, we'll have a dance. This is a John Ford moment, and that's very true in the Walking Dead. That it is showing that people can work together, and yes, you can say it is in response to this zombie threat. It provides a unifying force for the community, and indeed, one of the things I'm saying is that the appearance of the apocalypse throws people back on fundamental values that they've lost touch with. They rediscover the value of family. They rediscover the value of community. They understand that whatever they were fighting for at their job is meaningless in light of these deeper existential questions. The distinction here is something like World War Z, which asks you to turn to the United Nations to serve your local problem, rather than
discover the value of multilateralism.
It was really striking in studying invasion narratives in my last book. The invasion narratives of the 1950s, all these flying saucer movies came from outer space, and Earth versus the flying saucers and so on. If you go back and watch them now, they're incredible products of the Cold War. They present ordinary Americans as absolutely helpless. If the Martians arrive, the Americans rush right into the spaceship and get themselves killed. They try to use a gun to shoot at a flying saucer and so on. And they can only be saved by the federal government in these films. They can only be saved by a combination of the government, scientists, and the military. And these films celebrate the military-industrial complex as never before. And indeed, in the 50s, it was the age of the greatest prestige of science and industry. And they really all are, there's a kind of Cold War vision that the only thing standing between Americans and the annihilation by the Soviet Union read Mars, is the federal government. And again, the portrayal of local policemen, for example, they're shown as complete idiots in these shows. And again, some guy from the army has to show up and solve everything. And as I studied invasion narratives in the 21st century. I mean, starting with the X-Files, but including shows like The Event and V. It's really interesting because what I saw now was the invading force didn't stand for the Soviet Union or communism. It stood for our own government. That what the aliens represent in these shows is this massive federal bureaucracy that's taking over our lives. In V, for example, when the aliens arrive, they promise universal health care, blue energy, and a massive public works project. It was just extraordinary. The press jumped all over the show, is the queen of the aliens really President Obama? And of course the people making the show, oh no, we wrote this when Bush was still president. But it's just an extraordinary transformation that in the 50s the aliens represented our anxieties about this foreign government, and generally from about 2000 on, earlier, including the X-Files, the invaders are in cahoots with the federal government. They are a symbol for it, a shadow of. Fringe was, I think, the best series that had this aspect to it, and a wonderful, much underrated series where we were being invaded literally from a parallel universe. And in that parallel universe, for example, the Department of Homeland Security was housed in the base of the Statue of Liberty. It's just an incredible image for the fear of what has happened with the U.S. government in response to terrorism and the loss of civil liberties. And that Fringe was all about the militarization of the police and so on. Anyway, again, this will vary from show to show, but the ones that I admire are the ones, again, they're celebrating many American values. Help your neighbor is one of the great themes of The Walking Dead. So in that sense, I agree with you. I tend to admire the shows that have that spirit rather than the ones, and this goes all the way back to the George Romero zombie movies, which suggest your neighbor is your worst enemy. Yes?
So as much as there are these similarities between the apocalyptic movies and the westerns, wouldn't a basic difference be that, as you've described in the apocalyptic films, are really about reconnecting or recreating society in the face of things that we become dependent and are just out of control. We're reconnecting, recreating. Whereas the real classic Western is about creating, not recreating, but there is nothing there. You need to make a choice. You want law, or do you want the
Liberty Valance.
or the Comanches to just overpower.
Yeah.
Isn't that just a fundamental difference?
Yeah. No, I'm not saying they're the same thing.
In that sense, the Western is in a way more radical. That these apocalyptic films are a redemption, we're returning to what's the true values and what's real. Whereas the Western, you're making it. You need John Wayne, who's kind of out in the shadows, to come in and shoot someone or to retreat.
Yeah, that's a good point. But to blur the picture, Deadwood was about recreation. In the chapter on Deadwood in my book, I evoke the principle of the post-political, that Deadwood seems to be about an anarchic situation in this town in South Dakota. But in fact, when they organize, they say, well, let's have a mayor. As obvious, they've all come from civilized society and are recreating it rather than creating it. So I talked about the notion of the post-political in the work, drawing upon a lot of James Scott's work on anarchy and government, which I find very useful for understanding these zombie stories as well. James Scott's book, like The Art of Not Being Governed, he has this notion of shatter zones, places that exist between organized communities or governed communities, and he describes the zombie war perfectly. And again, I accept your point. I will say that because the Western often involves the movement from the East to the West, it often does have the recreative nature. In The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, for example, which is the story, James Stewart has come from the East with his law books with him, and the worst thing Liberty Valance does is to destroy those law books. So in some ways, even the Western is shadowed by the idea that all the stuff was out East, and do we now recreate it in the West? But yes, the Western can become more elemental, especially with Sergio Leone's Westerns, which are the truly Hobbesian ones. Again, Westerns vary between this Hobbes-Locke position. Deadwood is very Lockean. There's this great moment early in the series when the hero is speaking to Wild Bill Hickok, and Wild Bill Hickok says, we're close to statehood, but pretty soon we'll have government. And Seth Bullock says, I'll settle for property rights. The most Lockean moment in American television. And again, David Milch understands this so well. Yes.
So I have actually a similar question, which is that in these shows and in Westerns too, I mean, there's a sense in which, what you're describing, this moment of where you get great meaning in life from mere survival and return to the family and have a very local government. All of that is contingent and temporary on the way to reestablishing a more full-fledged civilization. So it seems that the problem that you're describing, centralized government bureaucracies, systems of medical care and education, are actually the goal of establishing civilization. The whole problem will articulate itself one more time.
Yes, that very well may be so. Now again, to refer to Deadwood really David Milch, the guy who created this, really balks on this issue. And it's funny because in the DVD they have some historians of the West who offer exactly that narrative, and he denies, he portrays in the show as that movement is bad. In fact, the guy I call the hero of the show, Al Swearingen, most people think of him as a villain, he sees telegraph wires coming to Deadwood, and one of his sidekicks says, we can get the baseball scores now and the price of gold more quickly. And he sees it as a terrible omen that they get reconnected to society. Just give me a minute here. So indeed, the problematic of all these shows is kind of independence versus security, the full civilization versus something more local. Now, for example, I was just fascinated with the latest episode of The Walking Dead on Sunday. It played right into my thesis. I wondered if they read my article. That is, they've had a hard time settling down. And in that show, every time they've been attracted to a community, what was the name of the one that the governor ran, that community? What? Woodbury. Yeah. Woodbury looked like Mayberry. It looked like this Andy Griffith sitcom village, Main Street, USA, and they came in, it turns out it was run by a madman. And last season they went to a place called Terminus, and they thought it was wonderful, except when they were invited to dinner, it was to be eaten by this group. So Walking Dead has kept this up, that the promise is continually to get back into civilization, and the heroes of the show want that, and they refuse to give up their hopes, but the show keeps tantalizing them with the prospect and then denying it, so that the latest development, they're now in Alexandria, Virginia. I mean, how close to D.C. can you get? Suburb of D.C., and it seems to be working out this time. They were so careful about going in. They've been burned twice in the show, and they're so careful. And it seems to be real that there's children playing, and it's an organized community, and it's safe. And Carl, my favorite character in the show, little Carl, is working out last Sunday's episode, and he says, "It's too safe here. We're going to get weak." It's amazing that the show, they've got these writers that, here it is. Now, who knows how this is going to work out? These people may be space aliens in Alexandria, Virginia, but it seems like the show is, again, aware of just the problem you're talking about, that you hold out the promise of finding that settled community again, and then realize maybe it's not what you want. And so there really is a deep resistance, I would say, in the American character to the institutionalized world, the secure world, and this longing to be on the frontier. Now,
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that. Thank you so much. I'm wondering, you identify Hobbesian themes in the state of war, but I'm wondering the way that you're describing all of this, that in fact maybe it's all anti-Hobbesian in that, our worst nightmare is going back to the state of nature, and then it comes true and we find out it's not all that bad. And so one of the themes, right, is that we should rebel against the appeal of commodious living, and that we shouldn't trade our liberties and our independence for them. So that's, I was wondering.
Yeah, I mean, there are two kinds of shows. There actually are Rousseauian ones too, where the state of nature is really attractive, but they're rather. No, I'm saying there are Hobbesian shows and Lockean shows. Walking Dead is anti-Hobbesian; it's Lockean. And Deadwood was Lockean. Again, I think you can divide up Westerns into Hobbesian and Lockean Westerns. That is, those who basically say that lack of order is sheer anarchy and is so bad you're better off with any government than none, which is kind of the theme of World War Z, where you end up being ruled by scientists, the UN, and Brad Pitt. You have to surrender to these superior forces because you're nothing. But the other shows really are anti-Hobbesian because they're showing that people are not just are able to take care of themselves, but they're better off if they take care of themselves. One of the most interesting characters in The Walking Dead was a woman named Andrea, who started off as a very troubled, psychologically anxious woman who was having trouble coping with life. And over a couple of seasons, especially once they gave her a gun, she got tough, she got disciplined. First she learned how to kill zombies, then she learned how to kill dangerous human beings, and she grew to love her gun and what it gave her. And there was a strong element of the notion of empowerment there, and that's certainly true for little Carl. Well, that's it never answers the question. For one thing, they're all written by large numbers of people. Walking Dead is particularly complicated because it was based on a pre-existing comic book, and Robert Kirkman, who wrote the comic books, is also one of the writers of the series. But the only TV writer I've ever spent any amount of time with was Vince Gilligan of Breaking Bad and now Better Call Saul, who's one of the greatest geniuses in television history, and Breaking Bad may be the greatest show ever on TV. I was very fortunate to spend about 20 minutes with him. He was the most ordinary human being you could ever meet. I mean, a genius, but you would not pick him out on the street as some great creative writer. For that matter, people walked right by Shakespeare in his day. Gentle Will, they thought he was so ordinary. So anyway, I don't know that we can solve any of these issues by saying something about the writers. Yes?
I don't know whether the doctors had drugs or the teachers had any books. But
No, the teachers had drugs and the doctors had books. No.
but the 47% famous from Governor Romney, he was roughly correct about that, who were dependent on government in one way or another. These people must be watching your shows, and you say, well, some of them, many of them, you say a lot because they're not working. You say it starts a debate. Is there any evidence that shows like this start a debate, or could it be that but it's just a fantasy. It's appealing precisely because it's distant from the government-dependent life.
Well, this is a very complicated issue here. I don't think I said these shows started a debate. I think they reflect a debate that's going on. I said from the beginning that there's a strong fantasy element in here. And I think it goes all the way back to the Western, that basically most Americans, like most people, want to be taken care of. But in their fantasy life, they wish they were John Wayne or Clint Eastwood. It's a reason, I think one reason why Westerns have been so popular and why now these shows are popular is they allow people to imagine themselves into a world where they would have their freedom and their independence. And I don't, I can imagine people who are very dependent on the government who might nevertheless like to fantasize that they're not. Since you brought up the issue of drugs and books, yes, there are books surviving, and they're rather precious in most of these shows. And medicine, yes, one of the great things in The Walking Dead is they're always out searching for the remaining medicine they need. So it is funny, you don't like the hospital, but you're happy with the drugs that it contains or dispenses. But again, it's people are often looking for some kind of one-to-one correspondence. People dependent on the government will not like these shows. People in Idaho will like these shows. It never quite works out that way, and it may well be that the people who are most dependent actually like these kind of fantasies. It's also reflected in superheroes in our popular culture. The Clark Kent Superman thing. It's one of the great fantasies in American popular culture that you seem like an ordinary schlemiel, but really you're Superman. By the way, Breaking Bad was a variant of this. That by day Walter White was this ordinary high school teacher, but his secret identity was as Heisenberg, the super criminal. And super criminals and superheroes in our culture are often intermixed. So again, I have no simple answer to your question. You could not predict the voting patterns of someone who watched The Walking Dead. What I do find odd and worth noting is that our general impression of Hollywood is that it's extremely left-wing and pro-government, and yet it does seem to be turning out these shows that raise serious questions about government. Revolution, which again was barely noticed, was about the most anti-government show I've ever seen. It's a show in which a group calling themselves the Patriots not a football team, turned out to be the most evil characters in the show. So again, I really can't answer your question other than to say that these things are very messy when you talk about popular culture. Who exactly likes what and what for is very hard to pin down. Yes.
Me?
Yes, go.
Well, I just wanted to respond to that actually with a small point. Have you heard of the Seasteading Institute?
Yes.
So that seems to be one possible concrete reflection of this urge to just...
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
This is a group of people, I think, most in Silicon Valley who...
Yeah.
want
Peter
to-
Thiel is one of their financiers.
To build rafts and just float off in the ocean and start their own governments.
It's a little more serious than that. It's to build a permanent platform. And yes. You can tell I've already signed up. Yes, go ahead.
I'm farthest imaginable from an expert on these kinds of shows, but I wonder if one could examine apocalyptic and grotesque themes in a Nietzschean or Dostoevskian lens, in addition to the Tocquevillean, Lockean, Hobbesian one.
Sure.
American life has become so emptied of demanding moral content, consumerism, decline of religion, relativism, relentless cheerfulness, at least for young people and people without children to raise. Maybe the wish being fulfilled, and I think that's always a good question to ask, is for a real, robust moral order, which necessarily demands and judges, which punishes, and therefore, only therefore, can provide, meaning, transcendence, akin to, medieval self-flagellation, things like that.
Okay, I agree. There's a lot of ways in which Nietzsche is applicable. You could say that these shows present the alternative to The Last Man. And here, the zombies are the last man. The zombies are images of mass man, of just this herd with no will. I mean, the image of zombies is a very Nietzschean image. It really is. People as a herd. So there's a Nietzschean aspect. But also, I'd say a lot of these shows, I think, appeal because they offer moral clarity. That one of the things that the apocalypse does is to simplify things and get people back to basics. Like, it's so strong in Falling Skies and in Walking Dead, learning to appreciate your children. And so many of these shows, I think, reflect the idea of people who've let their careers come in the face of their family. By the way, if any people would understand that, it would be Hollywood people. That you can sacrifice your family for the sake of your career. And so that is very strong that when the apocalypse comes, you learn what really mattered to you, and it turns out to be your family. And again, a lot of the effect of these shows is to clear away so many institutions that complicate life, that you understand what is fundamental, namely life itself. And a lot of people have. Jonah Goldberg wrote an interesting piece about Breaking Bad, where he stressed this point about the show offered moral clarity after a world where so many issues seem ambiguous and complicated. Yes.
No, I find the connection between westerns and the apocalyptic genre in this country convincing. But the first thing I thought of when I read the title of the talk was two things. One, the tradition of religious apocalypticism, and also the deep strain of millennial fervor that runs through the history of this country, at least. And I was wondering to what extent you see this genre indebted to those two things, which in some ways might have a different valence from the Western, since everything is kind of taken care of in an apocalypse, but also there's a kind of enemy, I guess.
Yeah. Well, in general, it is fascinating in our culture to see the secular equivalence of traditional religious patterns developing. We look back at the year 1000, and we kind of laugh now at all the predictions of the end of the world at that time. We say, oh, how quaint these medieval people were. Well, came the year 2000, and we had this Y2K thing, and we were seeing the end of the world coming too, and we laugh at the medieval people, and we repeated the same pattern. Now, by the way, there is a Chris Carter, who did the X-Files, also did a show called Millennium in the late 90s, which is one of the greatest TV shows ever done and totally neglected and very unfortunate. But that was all about millennial expectations, and it's an absolutely fascinating show. So yes, I'm aware of that. But again, time and again in our culture, we are repeating patterns which we find quaint, sometimes ridiculous, when we see the medieval manifestations of it. People find it, oh, look, these medieval people thought the world was ending. But we think the world is ending with a climate apocalypse or all this stuff about asteroids hitting us and so on. And I do think that there are certain human impulses that have traditionally manifested themselves in overt religious terms, which are getting in effect recycled in secular forms in our civilization, and again, it would vary from narrative to narrative. So yeah, I agree with that completely. Yes, back there.
There's also a fair amount of apocalyptic literature that exists.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you see a similarity between that and The only one I've ever read is Cormac
Is it-
McCarthy's The Road.
yeah.
Which seems to correspond to some of the themes that you have.
Yeah, oddly enough, I have read The Road and a couple of these things. I mean, when I slum, I slum. I go straight to television. If I read, it's Shakespeare. To put this rather bluntly, I'm not going to waste my reading time on this stuff. I will waste my time on TV. So I'm really much more knowledgeable about television and movies than I am about the literature. I read there's a book, actually someone has written a book about apocalyptic narratives and the state of nature, which I cite in Invisible Hand. The name of it is escaping. So I've been tempted. Now, Cormac McCarthy is a wonderful writer, and The Road is a very powerful book, and it is kind of Dostoevsky and Nietzsche in that sense. It's a very bleak image of the apocalypse and a very powerful one, and really, it is one of the great novels about the relationship between father and son. So it's a very powerful book, and I highly recommend it. But the kind of pop culture literature. I do not read pop culture literature. When I do, I usually find it inferior to the television and movie versions. But this always happens at these things. I call it the Ren and Stimpy problem. I'm talking about The Simpsons and South Park, and people want to hear about Ren and Stimpy, and I've never watched Ren and Stimpy. I'm actually proud to say I haven't watched every television program ever, and I haven't read every trashy book ever written. Yes.
I just want to pursue something you said about the creators. We know Hollywood is pro-big government and anti-states' rights, and they think all local police departments are racist. But then there's this group of creators that are doing these shows. Now, would they reject your thesis of what they're intending in here and saying it's all fun and doesn't mean anything? Are they spread out across the country and not in Hollywood, or are they in Hollywood but they're actually a revolution to what we've seen for 50 years?
It's very difficult to answer. Hollywood is a synecdoche, to be a television. To be an English professor once, that it's a part standing for the whole. I mean, in fact, the people who create television movies do not live in a 5-mile radius of Hollywood. They're all distributed all over, and today with computers and the internet, or Walking Dead is produced in Georgia. I don't know where the writers are living at any moment. They're probably not in the same place. It is interesting that I have some connections with the Hollywood writing community through a relative. I won't mention names here, but he actually says there are more libertarians in the Hollywood community than most people realize. And you see it in some odd places, and I've occasionally had contact. I mean, the people who create South Park are self-professed libertarians, Matt Stone and Trey Parker. So in some ways, we may be painting the Hollywood community with a broad brush and overestimating the extent to which it inclines left on issues. But the writers are quite varied in background. I will say they tend to be more highly educated than we realize. I can certainly say from the little contact I've had with people like Vince Gilligan, they are far more intelligent than we think. We as academics look down upon these people, and for one thing, think they can't possibly be intelligent. I have been at one conference with a bunch of Hollywood writers who were not very well known, but they were an extremely intelligent lot. It's not easy to write these TV shows. I might add it's also extremely financially rewarding, so it is attracting talented people. That's why I'm sure Shakespeare would be heading for Hollywood right now. The other thing I will say is that genres have a logic of their own. And so when you sit down to write a Western, an alien invasion era, in some ways you do get swept up in a process in which your intentionality is not governing. I have an essay on intentionality that begins my book, The Invisible Hand in Popular Culture. It's called How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Tube. We have a rather naive notion of intentionality, that there is a single person whose intentions create a show 100%. In fact, when you study the process, these movies, these television shows, are written in a kind of committee with people getting together through a process of feedback and evolution. We have a model of artistic creation that comes from the 19th century and the Romantics, which says that if a single person isn't governing the single intention of a work of art, it's somehow going to go wrong. In fact, it turns out in the highest levels of literary creation, there's a lot of, in effect, committee work going on. Wordsworth and Coleridge wrote their poems together. You study many 19th century novelists like Dickens, turns out they accepted a lot of suggestions from their publishers, from their audience. I've increasingly come to understand popular culture, and to some extent culture in general, on a model of feedback and of interaction between an author and an audience. Again, we have this romantic notion that an author must be off in a garret somewhere, and any contact with an audience will only compromise his vision. My book, Literature and the Economics of Liberty, begins with a long chapter on the 19th century novel, showing how people like Dickens fed off their audience and learned to write better by listening to the way their audience was reacting. Dickens had no idea that Little Nell was going to be a big deal when he started writing The Old Curiosity Shop. In fact, he didn't even think of it as a novel, but it started in installments. It started to sell really well, and especially when Little Nell was in it. And he rethought the whole thing on the basis of audience response, and this was fairly characteristic of his career. So again, when you talk about intentionality, it doesn't pin down to a single person, a single intention. And the more you hear, Walking Dead comes with a show, The Talking Dead. After every episode on AMC, they bring in a writer or a director or cast members, and when you hear how the show develops, they are always responding to the audience. To what the audience wants. Again, we think, well, that's messy and that's just going to ruin the shows. In fact, there's a kind of creative feedback that is very evident in popular culture, but it turns out, again, if you go back to particularly the 19th century novel, you see things work there as well. Yes?
Well, let me ask.
Please.
Shakespeare bounces his ideas off Bacon?
Shakespeare bounced his ideas off his theater company. Shakespeare was an actor and a stockholder in the Lord Chamberlain's Men, later the King's Men. He was very much an active man of the theater, and I believe he was a better dramatist because of that he was not, it's actually unusual. He was one of the few authors then who more or less wrote his plays single-handedly. It's actually interesting to go back to that period. Most of the plays were collaborative, 2 or 3 authors. There are indications that Shakespeare, early in his career, was a script doctor, that he was brought in to juice up scripts. There's a play, Sir Thomas More, that actually the only bit of Shakespeare's composition that may exist in his own handwriting is a scene for this play, Sir Thomas More, that he wrote to be inserted in it. But he had a lot of interaction with his theater company and his audience, and responded to them. Now, it's not that Henry IV Part 1 was a success, so he did Henry IV Part 2. It's not quite Hollywood that way. But, for example, the character of Falstaff was so popular, he almost was forced to include him in Henry V, and he evidently wrote a whole play, The Merry Wives of Windsor, supposedly at the request of Queen Elizabeth, but in any case because the audience wanted that. I mean, he lived up on stage. He was in a very immediate relation to his audience, and I think he fed off that, and he very much worked with his theater company. For example, in Shakespeare's early comedies, the comic figure is a clown who does little dances and little dialogues with himself. We know that the actor in Shakespeare's troupe who played these roles was a man named Will Kemp, and who specialized in that kind of role. Now, Will Kemp was an idiot and decided to leave the best company in the Elizabethan theater and start his own company. And suddenly Shakespeare was faced with not having his main comedian, and they got a guy named Robert Armin, who evidently had a good singing voice and specialized in fools. And so Shakespeare, you can see the point. It's As You Like It when Shakespeare starts writing for fools, not for clowns, in his play. And we get, as a touchstone, we get Feste and Twelfth Night, and then we get The Fool and King Lear. Now, nobody else could have written King Lear, but that Shakespeare wrote that part for the fool in the play is probably a result of Robert Armin and Shakespeare saying, this guy is really good, I'm going to write him a part like no one's ever seen before for a fool. And so in that sense, I think this great aspect of King Lear, the fool, is in part a product of the theater history of Shakespeare's company, and there's nothing wrong with that. Shakespeare was better as a dramatist for being a man of the theater. It's one of the reasons why these claims that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare are idiotic. They want the plays to be written by an aristocrat, not by a guy who's documented as a member of a theater company and who was an actor and who would know how to write a play as a result of that, not as for being the Earl of Oxford.
Now I got a question about going back to TV.
Yes.
So you present conservatism as the fantasy life of Hollywood liberals.
Well, that's it, or libertarianism. Yeah,
but isn't the point that they keep it on the level of fantasy? And couldn't one therefore say that what they do is to try to bring out the conservatism which is still remaining in the psyche of the American people and purge it?
Yes, you've come up with the subversion containment thesis of the new historicism. Here, I'm very. You've been hanging out with Stephen Greenblatt lately.
Must be wrong.
No. In other words, one of the theories of the new historicism about, say, Elizabethan drama, is that to the extent it was revolutionary, it was really conservative. That is, when these dramatists portrayed, let's say, Shakespeare's Richard II, the deposition of a monarch, you could say that was really revolutionary. And Franco Moretti, who was just here on Monday, has argued that the whole of the Elizabethan theater prepared the way for Charles I, that the execution of Charles I was prepared by decades of plays that portrayed kings and queens being deposed and of kings being humiliated and stripped naked, and it desacralized the kingship, as Moretti argues. Against that, people say, no, this was a kind of Aristotelian catharsis, that you let people purge their rebelliousness by seeing the things they wanted acting out on the stage, but that got it out of their system. So indeed, ever since Plato and Aristotle argued about this, we've had this question: when you see a drama, does it arouse your emotions and want you to go out and do likewise? You see a king deposed, you want to go out and depose the king, or does it act in a cathartic way and get it out of your system? Again, I don't think any of this is clearly planned or thought out, and that you can make uniform statements about it. Again, there are in fact people in the Hollywood community who are genuinely conservative or genuinely libertarian. Certainly part of what's going on is people feeling their way towards what the audience will like, and that's partially based on the fantasies that appeal to them. On the other, one thing that I always have to point out to people is that being academics, we tend to bracket out the issue of quality. I mean, one reason The Walking Dead succeeds, it's a pretty good show. It's well written. The cast is extraordinarily good, and many of the characters are likable, so you want to come back to them week after week. Again, it's not a great show. Again, it's not the level of Breaking Bad. But still, there's a lot of talent that goes into it. One reason I think popular culture functions as well as it does is it has a kind of Darwinian nature that you just throw out all these mutant TV shows and see which ones succeed. So that, for example, Revolution, which has all the ideological components I've referred to, it was just a bad show. I forced myself to watch it for purely intellectual reasons. It was badly written. The actors were bad. The characters were generally unlikable. I don't know what they were thinking with that show. And again, it managed to last 2 seasons, more or less. So, again, I find it very hard to say what the function or how all these things are functioning in our culture. They're functioning in many different ways. I just think it's interesting to put the spotlight on some of them. Yes?
You see in some of these shows and movies a case for isolationism. In World War Z, the 2 countries that do best in the movie
Yes,
are
yeah.
Israel, which completely walls itself off, and its defenses are only breached when they let in groups of refugees, and North Korea, which completely seals itself off and pulls the teeth of all its citizens.
Yes. And Cuba. Don't forget Cuba. Oh, that's more in the book that Cuba's in the book Cuba is presented as another ideal regime.
In The Walking Dead, we have our group of heroes who set up in a prison and are content to have their small Jeffersonian republic, essentially, of agriculture. Our hero Rick returns to his farm. They're content to avoid contact with any of the groups. In contrast with Woodbury, which is essentially a replication of any American small town, under the governor, which seeks to expand itself and seize new territory, which brings them into conflict with our heroes.
Yeah, to fill in on that, I mean, one issue I'm very interested in globalization. The Gilligan Unbound book is subtitled Pop Culture in the Age of Globalization. I'm very interested in how television confronts globalization. And one aspect of the interest in zombies is as an image of globalization. It's very strong in World War Z. Not so much in The Walking Dead, which has confined itself largely to America, but in some ways, in some of these stories, I believe that the zombie plague reflects anxieties about globalization. It's this plague that moves from country to country. A lot of these some of these stories reflect fears about immigration, and as I said, very often the zombies vaguely represent third world peoples of various kinds. And in the Gilligan Unbound book, I discussed this particularly in connection with the X-Files, but again with a number of these alien invasion narratives. I mean, quite honestly, one of the great puns in American popular culture is alien as an extraterrestrial and alien as an illegal alien. And in the X-Files, so many of the episodes about aliens were about vaguely ethnic people from other countries. So yes, these shows reflect anxieties about forces in the world. Actually, my alien invasion chapter is entitled Un-American Gothic. So I think it's a pretty clever title because it reflects the new Gothicism of something that's un-American coming to the country. So there are a lot of anxieties like that are reflected in these shows. And it ties in with this notion that, yeah, some people would like to live in a very local world. The Walking Dead is an extreme version of the buy local movement and the fear of anything that's from outside the clan. It's very interesting to see how that develops. And the fear is that there are these alien forces that are introducing foreign elements into the population. This was very strong in a show called Invasion that I write about in my book. So, yeah, there are so many aspects of this. I've really tried to focus on one aspect today, but you could do a whole take on the zombie narrative as just the fear of sheer numbers. I mean, that's the point in these zombie narratives. An individual zombie is not that frightening or threatening, but they just keep coming. In the show Invasion, these people show up. Actually, this was true in the show V as well. In Invasion, it was a pod people narrative. These people show up and they breed very fast. And in V, there was this kind of queen bee, and she, it's that typical fear about alien populations that they breed so fast. They're going to overwhelm us with their numbers. It's really interesting to see how that anxiety comes up in American popular culture.
Question over here.
He's in my class. I gotta give him a chance.
In The Walking Dead, where the virus is dormant inside everyone, and if they die, regardless of the cause, it's not necessarily zombies who are the vector of the disease, rather any death. Is there any significance to that in terms of not being as much an alien population to avoid, but that it's kind of omnipresent?
I've never thought about that, but it goes back to that question about the democratic bias of the show, that it doesn't want to show the zombies as uniquely evil, but we're all potentially zombies. That, of course, was an incredibly dramatic moment when that was revealed in the first season, I think. Yeah. Now.
So bringing it back to Shakespeare and questions of individual genius versus collaboration.
Yes.
So, thinking back to Pericles of Prince of Tyre, apparently Shakespeare collaborated on this play with, other writers, and it's generally considered one of his worst plays. So how does that relate to the idea of collaboration and feedback sort of resulting in a better product?
Well, I said that Shakespeare was unusual in that generally he wrote his plays himself. For example, it was famous that just as Hollywood does, they would bring in a script doctor to write jokes. I guess Christopher Marlowe couldn't write jokes very well. They brought in a guy named William Rowley to add the jokes to Dr. Faustus. Now, one of the things about Shakespeare, and actually makes him unique, is he wrote comedy as well as he wrote tragedy, so he wrote his whole plays. Now, it does appear that at the beginning of his career and the end of his career, he did collaborative stuff. And quite frankly, it's among his worst stuff. At the beginning of his career, no one knew who he was. He was just a kid from Stratford. He wasn't the Earl of Oxford. He was just starting, and he may have worked with other playwrights on those early plays and gradually proved himself, and then they realized we can leave Bill alone, let him write the whole play. At the end of his career, I personally believe he was hoping to retire and get out. Again, I personally believe he was hoping to retire so he could sit down and prepare a publishable edition of his plays, but alas, died a couple of years into that enterprise. But it does seem as if his company said, he was a shareholder in the company, so he had a financial stake in this. He was an extremely wealthy man as a result. And I think his colleagues said, okay, Will, we understand you want to retire, but could you just help us out, write a few more plays, help bring John Fletcher along, write a couple of plays with John Fletcher, and then, you got a financial interest in it. If we can build up John Fletcher, the John Fletcher brand, you'll profit from it. And John Fletcher then, along with Beaumont, another one of the great collaborations, Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher, they became the successors to Shakespeare, and he was profiting from that. So I did not offer examples of his collaborations as a writer. I was talking about his interaction with his theater company. I think in his case he was able to write great plays himself and wrote his best plays when he was writing them himself. But I think there were reasons, again, at the beginning and end of his career, why he was willing to enter into collaborations with rather unfortunate results compared to his other plays. Pericles is a particular mystery. The first two acts of Pericles, if they were written by him, were by so far the worst thing he ever wrote that most people don't think he wrote them, and I don't either. Yes?
You said that it seems to me the two art forms are extremely different. I mean, when I read Shakespeare, I read it, and I don't get it on the first reading, I don't get it on the second reading, and you have to pour and study and really think about it. It's extremely discursive, and the TV show is more a Gesamtkunstwerk, and I don't know, would you really have gone into TV?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
To remember, he never published any of his works, and they were not ostensibly designed to be read. These plays were written for a medium which was far more vulgar than American television, namely Elizabethan theater. And if you read third-rate Elizabethan dramas, they're worse than anything that's on American television. Shakespeare is not. He had, as Walter Kaufman once put it, Shakespeare could give his pearls the odor of the barnyard before casting them before swine. I mean, the great ability was he could write these great plays and still be very successful. I think he would be doing the same thing. If you take Deadwood and read the scripts of Deadwood, they are incredibly complex. There's even one point in the third season where David Milch weaved in some lines from Shakespeare, and nobody but me evidently noticed it. But showing that my dialogue's as good as Shakespeare, it's indistinguishable. So these, and today we have to watch these, now not The Walking Dead, but Breaking Bad, Deadwood. You have to watch them several times to realize how complex they are. So again, it's a very complicated question, the relationship between the texts of Shakespeare's plays we have and what was actually performed. The case of King Lear and Hamlet, for example, the texts we have are far longer than could ever have been produced on the Elizabethan stage, leading us to believe that Shakespeare had in mind something that could be staged and then something that would later be published. That's why I think he did retire when he did, in the hopes of preparing the published editions. He died too soon after, I think, preparing a handful of texts like Coriolanus and Antony and Cleopatra. Still, what would he do today? He was a very ambitious and very money-conscious person, from everything we can tell. And so he would have gone into writing television and produced magnificent works. Now, Breaking Bad and Deadwood are not as good as Shakespeare's plays, but they're pretty close to almost any other drama I can think of in terms of quality. So Shakespeare would have done something with television that we can't imagine, because he's Shakespeare and we're not. And he would have produced something that was incredibly complex. I mean, when he went into the theater, it was disgraceful. It was the only thing he could do. Now, there are signs he tried to write fancy poems early in his career and dedicate them to the Earl of Southampton and get out of this awful playwriting business. Fortunately, that didn't work. And I think he gradually realized he was in the right business. So, again, we all think of media as limiting because we're not artists. Where we see limits, the great artists see challenges. Shakespeare, and it's already happened in television that people like Milch and Vince Gilligan, and going back to Chris Carter, have taken it to a level of artistic value that was incomprehensible to people. When Theodore Adorno was watching television in the 1950s, besides the fact that he couldn't understand it, because he was German, he was watching 15-minute infomercials and thinking this was the medium and telling us how horrible television was, and it would never get anywhere. And quite frankly, Marshall McLuhan made similar mistakes in his evaluation of television. Marshall McLuhan, who defined television as a low-definition medium. I hope wherever he is now, he's sitting in front of an HD TV. But in any case, I think, we say television would not have been adequate to Shakespeare. He would have made it adequate. That's why he was Shakespeare. He took the Elizabethan theater, which, believe me, was no thing of beauty when he found it, with the exception of Christopher Marlowe's plays. But even they are so limited. He saw this and he took it and said, "This is going to be my baby now, and watch what I can do with it."
This man specializes in the high and the low.
But
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you all. My point is, you can't always tell the high from the low.
Yeah.